In one of the most prestigious pizza chain restaurants in New York, a symbol of success and inclusion, a silent investigation was about to unearth dark secrets. Michael Carter, a respected black entrepreneur who built his empire from scratch, couldn't imagine the challenges he would face when he decided to disguise himself as a homeless person to observe his employees' behavior without being recognized. As he mingled among the customers, his presence went unnoticed by everyone except a young woman named Emily, a compassionate and determined employee. Soon, Michael would discover that Emily's struggle against discrimination and prejudice within the company he had built would be the trigger for a profound transformation. What he would find on his journey would not only test his values and principles, but also lead him down a path of personal redemption. What hidden truths would come to light? How could one young woman's commitment to equality trigger changes that would resonate throughout the entire company? Before we dive into this story, filled with unexpected twists and lessons in justice and inclusion, comment where you're watching from today. And if you like stories with surprising endings and moments of transformation, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The afternoon sun filtered through the large windows of Michael Carter's office, bathing the diplomas and awards adorning the walls in golden light. At 45, Michael was the epitome of success, a black entrepreneur who had built one of the most successful pizza chain restaurants in New York from the ground up. His face, with strong features and penetrating gaze, regularly appeared in business magazines and television programs. However, on this day, Michael wasn't sitting behind his imposing mahogany desk. Instead, he stood in front of a full-length mirror, carefully observing his reflection. He no longer wore his usual impeccable suit, but worn-out pants, a faded t-shirt, and a tattered jacket. His face, usually clean-shaven, sported several days' worth of stubble, and his hair, normally short and neat, was disheveled and covered by a dirty cap. "Are you sure about this, boss?" asked David, his personal assistant, as he handed him an old backpack filled with used clothes. Michael nodded, not taking his eyes off the mirror. "Completely, David. It's the only way to really know what's going on in our branches." Michael's decision to disguise himself as a homeless person hadn't been taken lightly. The recent retirement of his administrative director and trusted friend, Robert Deese, had left a void in the company. More than just an executive, Robert had been the guardian of the values of inclusion and respect that Michael considered fundamental to his business. "I need to see with my own eyes how our employees behave when they think no one is watching," Michael continued, adjusting his cap, "especially with those whom society tends to marginalize." David, who had been working with Michael for years, perfectly understood his boss's concern. Together, they had built a company that not only stood out for the quality of its products, but for its commitment to diversity and equal opportunities. However, lately, disturbing rumors had reached their ears about the treatment of certain customers and employees in some branches. "Where do you plan to start?" asked David, handing Michael a fake ID and some cash. "At the downtown branch," Michael replied, tucking the items into his jacket pockets. "I've heard concerning comments about the work environment there." David nodded, remembering the complaints they had received in recent months. "Be careful, boss. And remember, if you need anything, I'll be just a phone call away." Michael smiled, grateful for his assistant's loyalty. "Thanks, David. Keep everything in order here. If anyone asks." "We'll say you're on a business trip," David completed. "Don't worry. Everything will be under control." With one last glance in the mirror, Michael headed for the door. Before leaving, he stopped and looked at David. "This goes beyond business, my friend. It's about making sure that the values we preach are actually practiced. I can't lead a company that doesn't respect the dignity of every person, regardless of their appearance or condition." David nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I know, boss. And that's why all of us who really know you respect you so much." With these words resonating in his mind, Michael left his office, leaving behind the comfort and luxury he was accustomed to. As he descended in the service elevator to avoid being recognized, he felt a mixture of nervousness and determination. He knew that what he was about to do could change the course of his company and perhaps his life. As he left the building through the back door, Michael blended into the crowd filling the streets of downtown New York. For the first time in years, He walked among people without anyone recognizing him, without the looks of admiration or envy he was used to. It was a strange but liberating sensation. As he headed towards the downtown branch, Michael reflected on the path that had led him here. He remembered the obstacles he had faced as a black entrepreneur in a world dominated by white faces, the doors that had been closed to him, and the prejudices he had to overcome. Those experiences had forged his determination to create a company where everyone, regardless of their origin or appearance, would have the same opportunities. Now, disguised and anonymous, he was about to put to the test whether those ideals had really taken root in the culture of his company. With each step he took towards the pizzeria, Michael felt that he was getting closer, not only to discovering the truth about his employees, but also to confronting a part of himself that he had left behind long ago. What Michael didn't know was that this experiment would not only reveal the true nature of his company, but would also lead him on an unexpected journey of self-discovery and personal change. He was about to immerse himself in an experience that would shake the foundations of everything he had built and confront him with decisions he never imagined having to make. The aroma of freshly baked pizza filled Michael's senses as he approached the downtown branch. It was a familiar smell, one he usually associated with pride and success. However, today, dressed in rags and aware of the disgusted looks he received from passers-by, that aroma carried a bittersweet flavor. With deliberately slow and slightly hesitant steps, Michael entered the pizzeria. The buzz of conversations and the clinking of cutlery filled the air. He observed how the customers, mostly office workers and students, enjoyed their meals, oblivious to his presence. As he approached the counter, he noticed how employees exchanged uncomfortable glances. A young waitress, no more than 25 years old, with her hair tied back in a ponytail and kind eyes, approached him with some caution. "Good afternoon, sir. How can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Michael, maintaining his role, responded in a hoarse voice, "Good. Could I have a glass of water, please?" The waitress, whose name tag identified her as Emily, nodded with a small smile. "Of course, I'll bring it to you right away." As Emily walked away, Michael noticed how other employees looked at her with disapproval. A middle-aged man, wearing a manager's uniform, approached her and whispered something in her ear, casting sidelong glances at Michael. Emily returned moments later with a glass of water. "Here you go, sir. Do you need anything else?" Michael was about to respond when a familiar voice interrupted him. "Michael, what a surprise to see you here." Michael's heart skipped a beat. He turned slowly to find himself face to face with Richard Foster, an old friend and business partner. Richard looked at him with a mixture of confusion and concern. "Excuse me, sir," Emily intervened, noticing the discomfort on Michael's face. "I think you're confusing our customer with someone else." Richard blinked, looking from Michael to Emily and back. "But I'm sure that—" Michael, maintaining his act, lowered his gaze and mumbled, "I don't know what you're talking about, sir. I just came for some water." The confusion on Richard's face gave way to understanding. With a quick look around, he seemed to grasp the situation. "Oh, I'm so sorry. It must be a mistake. You reminded me of someone I know." With one last complicit look at Michael, Richard walked away, leaving an awkward silence behind. Emily, showing empathy that moved Michael, addressed him with a kind voice. "Don't worry, sir. Take your time with the water. If you need anything else, don't hesitate to ask." As Emily walked away to attend to other customers, Michael observed how the manager called her aside. Although he couldn't hear the conversation, it was evident from the body language that the man was reprimanding Emily. Michael continued his observation, noticing how other employees treated customers. Most were efficient but cold, especially with those who appeared to have fewer resources. However, Emily stood out, treating everyone with the same kindness and respect. As he slowly sipped his water, Michael witnessed a scene that turned his stomach. A young student, clearly of indigenous origin, entered the pizzeria. Immediately, he noticed how some employees exchanged glances and whispered comments. The manager, whose name tag identified him as Oscar, approached the young man with a hostile attitude. "I'm sorry, but you can't be here if you're not going to consume," Oscar said. his tone making it clear that he expected the young man to leave. The student, visibly uncomfortable, replied, "But I'm here to pick up a takeout order. I placed it by phone half an hour ago." Oscar frowned, as if doubting the young man's word. "Do you have the order number?" As the student nervously searched his phone, Michael noticed Emily approaching with a takeout bag. "Excuse me, are you the one who ordered the family-size pepperoni pizza?" Emily asked the student, ignoring Oscar's furious glare. The young man nodded, relieved. Emily handed him the order with a kind smile, treating him with the same respect she had shown to all customers. Oscar, visibly annoyed, walked away muttering something under his breath. Michael had to restrain himself from intervening, reminding himself that his role was to observe, not act, at least not yet. As the afternoon progressed, Michael witnessed more similar situations. He saw how Oscar created an atmosphere of tension among the employees, how some customers were treated with disdain based on their appearance, and how Emily seemed to be the only one who maintained the values of respect and inclusion that he had wanted to instill in his company. As night fell, Michael left the pizzeria with a heavy heart. What he had seen had opened his eyes to a reality he didn't want to believe existed in his own company. But he had also found a ray of hope in Emily, an employee who embodied everything he valued. As he walked back to his apartment, where he would change before returning to his real life, Michael knew this was just the beginning. He would have to continue investigating, observing, and eventually making difficult decisions. What he didn't know was that his encounter with Emily and the situations he had witnessed that day were about to trigger a series of events that would change not only the course of his company, but also his own life in ways he could never have imagined. The following days turned into an emotional roller coaster for Michael. Each morning, he woke up in his luxurious apartment, looked in the mirror, and saw the successful entrepreneur who had built an empire. Then, with a mixture of determination and apprehension, he transformed into the homeless man he had created for his investigation. In the downtown pizzeria, Michael became a constant presence, sitting in a corner with his glass of water, silently observing the comings and goings of employees and customers. With each passing hour, the division between the environment he had imagined for his company and the reality lived in that branch became more evident. Oscar, the manager, emerged as the architect of a toxic work environment. His derogatory comments towards certain customers and employees were subtle but constant, creating an atmosphere of tension and discrimination that seemed to have become normalized among the staff. "That guy again," Michael heard Oscar mutter one day, referring to a customer of humble appearance. "Don't we have a policy to keep the undesirables out?" These words made Michael clench his fists under the table, fighting against the impulse to reveal his identity and put an end to everything right there. But he knew he needed to see more, to understand the magnitude of the problem before acting. In the midst of this hostile environment, Emily shone like a beacon of hope. Her kind and respectful treatment towards everyone, regardless of their appearance or condition, strongly contrasted with the attitude of her colleagues. Michael watched her interact with customers, always with a genuine smile and kind words. One day, Michael witnessed an act that deeply moved him. An elderly man entered the pizzeria, clearly disoriented and confused. While other employees ignored him or looked at him with annoyance, Emily approached him gently. "Good afternoon, sir. Can I help you with anything?" she asked, her voice full of warmth. The old man looked at her with eyes clouded by age. I think I'm lost. I can't remember how to get home." Michael observed how Emily, instead of simply asking him to leave, sat down with the old man and patiently helped him remember his address. Then, to everyone's surprise, she left the pizzeria with him, apparently to ensure he got home safely. When Emily returned, about 20 minutes later, Oscar was waiting for her with a barely contained expression of fury. "Who do you think you are to abandon your post?" Oscar spat, his voice loud enough for Michael to hear. "This is not a charity center, Emily. The next time you do something like this, consider yourself fired." Michael observed how Emily, despite the threat, maintained her composure. "I'm sorry, Oscar, but I couldn't leave that gentleman alone and confused. I did what I thought was right." Emily's response only seemed to infuriate Oscar more. who walked away muttering something about employees who don't know their place. This incident solidified Michael's admiration for Emily. Not only was she kind and respectful, but she also had the courage to defend her principles, even in the face of the threat of losing her job. However, not everything was light in the pizzeria. Michael also began to notice worrying patterns in the management of the place. On more than one occasion, he saw Oscar and another employee, a young man named Matt, taking boxes of ingredients at the end of the day. At first, he thought it might be part of normal inventory, but the frequency and secrecy with which they did it raised his suspicions. One day, while pretending to sleep in a corner of the pizzeria, Michael overheard a conversation between Oscar and Matt that confirmed his fears. "Make sure no one sees you taking those boxes out," Oscar whispered. "If anyone asks, say they're waste we're going to throw away." Matt nodded nervously. "Are you sure we won't get caught? If the boss finds out..." Oscar let out a derisive laugh. "The boss? That rich black guy never sets foot in here. He's too busy appearing on TV and giving speeches about inclusion and other nonsense. As long as the numbers look good, he doesn't care what really happens." Michael felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. Not only were they stealing from the company, but Oscar was sowing a culture of contempt for the values that he, as the founder, considered fundamental. As the days passed, Michael found himself increasingly immersed in his role as a silent observer. He began to notice the small details, how some employees treated customers differently based on their appearance, how closed groups and circles formed among the staff, excluding those who didn't fit in, but he also noticed positive things. He saw how Emily, despite Oscar's hostility, continued trying to create a more welcoming environment. He observed her discreetly defending a co-worker when Oscar publicly humiliated him for a minor mistake. And to his surprise, he noticed how some younger employees began to imitate Emily's behavior, treating customers with more respect and kindness. One day, while Michael was sitting in his usual corner, Emily approached him with a slice of pizza. "Here," she said quietly, making sure no one else saw her. "I know you only asked for water, but I thought you might be hungry." Michael, moved by the gesture, took the slice with trembling hands. "Thank you," he mumbled, maintaining his role. "You're very kind." Emily smiled warmly at him. "It's nothing. We all deserve to be treated with dignity. Don't you think?" As Emily walked away to attend to other customers, Michael felt a mixture of emotions. On one hand, he was deeply impressed and grateful for Emily's compassion. On the other, he felt a growing frustration and disappointment at the contrast between her and the general atmosphere of the pizzeria. That night, back in his apartment, Michael faced a difficult decision. He had seen enough to know that he needed to make drastic changes in the management of his company. But he had also discovered in Emily someone who perfectly embodied the values he wanted to promote. As he looked out the window at the city lights, Michael began to form a plan. He was not only going to correct the problems he had discovered, but he was going to completely turn around the culture of his company. And Emily, he realized, could be the key to achieving it. What Michael didn't know was that his actions in the coming days would not only change the course of his company, but would also lead him to face truths about himself that he had ignored for a long time. The road ahead was full of challenges, revelations, and perhaps an opportunity to rediscover the passion and purpose that had driven him to create his company in the first place. The next morning, Michael woke up with renewed determination. He knew he needed to delve deeper into Emily's life and the dynamics of the pizzeria before making drastic decisions. With this goal in mind, he decided to risk interacting more with her and other employees. That afternoon, when he entered the pizzeria with his usual disheveled appearance, he noticed there was more movement than usual. Colorful posters announced an upcoming celebration, the anniversary of the founding of the pizza chain. The irony wasn't lost on Michael. His company would celebrate its achievements while he, its founder, sat in a corner disguised as a homeless person. As he observed, he saw Emily decorating the tables with small centerpieces. He approached slowly, feigning interest in the decorations. "It looks nice," he murmured, maintaining his role. Emily smiled at him, surprised by his interest. "Thank you. It's for the company anniversary. You know, the founder started from the bottom, like many of us. It's an inspiring story. Michael felt a pang in his chest. Really? What do you know about him? Well, not much personally, Emily admitted. But I know he's a black man who faced many obstacles. He built all this, she gestured, encompassing the pizzeria, promoting values of inclusion and respect. At least, that's what they tell us in the training sessions. The bitterness in Emily's last phrase didn't go unnoticed by Michael. You don't believe it's true? Emily looked around, making sure no one was listening. I want to believe it. I really do. But sometimes it seems like those values only exist on paper. At that moment, Oscar appeared, his gaze fixed on Emily and Michael. Emily, what are you doing talking to him? There's work to be done. I don't care, Oscar cut her off. And you, he addressed Michael, if you're not going to consume, it's time for you to leave. Michael prepared to leave, but Emily intervened. It's okay, Oscar. I'll pay for his meal today. The surprise on Oscar's face quickly turned to disgust. As you wish, but it comes out of your salary. When Oscar walked away, Michael looked at Emily with genuine gratitude. Sure, you didn't have to do that. It's nothing, she replied with a tired smile. We all need a little kindness from time to time, don't you think? As Emily went to get the food, Michael reflected on what he had just witnessed. Emily's compassion, contrasted with Oscar's harshness, was a perfect reflection of the duality he had observed in his company. When Emily returned with a slice of pizza, Michael decided to risk asking more questions. Tyson, it doesn't seem easy to work here. Emily sighed, sitting down for a moment in the chair across from him. It has its challenges, but I need this job. My father is sick and the treatments are expensive. I'm so sorry, said Michael, feeling a genuine connection with Emily. It must be difficult. It is, she admitted, but I keep hoping things will get better. I dream of moving up someday, maybe even becoming a manager. Although with Oscar here, she left the sentence unfinished, her gaze lost in the distance. Michael was about to respond when the pizzeria door burst open. To his horror, he saw Richard Foster enter, the same friend who had almost discovered his identity days ago. Richard looked around the pizzeria until his eyes landed on Michael. His expression went from confusion to recognition and then to concern. Michael, he exclaimed, approaching quickly. What the hell are you doing? I've been trying to contact you for days. Emily looked between Michael and Richard, her face a mixture of confusion and suspicion. Michael, you know each other? Michael stood up, his mind working at full speed to find a way out. Richard, please, he whispered, not here. Richard, catching the urgency in his friend's voice, nodded slowly. I must have been confused. I'm sorry. But the damage was already done. Emily was looking at Michael with a mixture of curiosity and disappointment. Who are you really? She asked quietly. Michael knew the moment of truth had arrived. He looked around, noticing that several employees and customers were watching the scene with interest. Emily, he began, his voice trembling slightly, there's something I need to tell you, but not here. Can we talk in private after your shift? Emily looked at him steadily for a long moment before nodding slowly. All right, my shift ends at 8. As Emily walked away to continue her work, Michael turned to Richard. I need you to leave now. I'll explain everything later, I promise. Richard, although clearly confused and worried, respected his friend's request and left the pizzeria. Michael stayed there, aware that the next few hours would be crucial. He had been discovered earlier than he had planned, and now he would have to face the consequences of his deception, especially with Emily. As he waited for the hours to pass until the end of Emily's shift, Michael couldn't stop thinking about how he would explain his actions. He knew he ran the risk of losing the trust he had built with her, but he also felt he owed her the truth. What Michael didn't know was that this unexpected revelation was about to trigger a series of events that would change not only the course of his investigation, but also his perspective on his company and on himself. The conversation he would have with Emily that night would be just the beginning of a much deeper transformation than he had ever imagined. The clock struck 8:05 p.m. when Emily emerged from the pizzeria's back door. Michael was waiting nervously, leaning against the alley wall. He no longer wore his homeless disguise. Instead, he was dressed in a simple but elegant suit, more in line with his true identity. Emily stopped short upon seeing him, her eyes scanning his transformed figure. "Well," she said, with a mixture of surprise and caution in her voice, "it seems you had more than a hidden identity." Michael took a step forward, his hands extended in a gesture of peace. "Emily, I know I owe you an explanation, and I promise I'll tell you the whole truth. Can we go somewhere quieter to talk?" After a moment of hesitation, Emily nodded. "There's a park nearby. We can talk there." They walked in silence until they reached the park, the tension between them palpable. Finally, they sat on a secluded bench under the dim light of a street lamp. "All right," said Emily, crossing her arms. "Start talking." Michael took a deep breath. My real name is Michael Carter. I'm the founder and CEO of the pizza chain where you work." He watched as Emily's eyes widened, a mix of emotions crossing her face: surprise, confusion, and then a spark of anger. "You've been pretending all this time. You've been spying on us." Emily's voice trembled slightly. "Yes and no," Michael replied, keeping his voice calm. "I came to investigate because I had heard rumors about problems in some branches. I wanted to see for myself how employees and customers were really treated, especially those that society tends to marginalize." Emily stared at him for a long moment. "And what did you discover?" Michael sighed. "I discovered that the values I wanted to instill in my company aren't always practiced. I saw discrimination, mistreatment, even corruption, but also—" He paused, looking directly at Emily. "I also saw hope in you." Emily remained silent for a moment, processing the information. "In me? What do you mean?" "I saw how you treated everyone with respect and kindness, regardless of their appearance or condition," Michael explained. "I saw how you defended your co-workers and customers when Oscar mistreated them. You're the kind of person I always wanted to represent my company." Emily blushed slightly at the compliment, but then frowned. "If you really value these things, why have you allowed someone like Oscar to remain in his position? Why haven't you done anything to change the situation?" The question hit Michael like a punch to the stomach. It was a truth he had been avoiding facing. "You're right," he admitted, lowering his gaze. "I've distanced myself too much from the day-to-day operations of the company. I convinced myself that if the numbers looked good, everything was functioning as it should. It was a mistake, and I'm determined to correct it." Emily looked at him with a mixture of understanding and challenge. "And how do you plan to do that?" Michael straightened up, a new determination shining in his eyes. "I'm going to make significant changes, starting with this branch. Oscar will be removed from his position, and I'll take measures to ensure that our values are truly practiced, not just preached." He paused, looking directly at Emily. "And I'd like you to be part of those changes." Emily blinked, surprised. "Me? How?" "I've seen your potential, Emily," Michael said sincerely. "You have the skills and values we need to transform this company. I'd like to offer you a position of greater responsibility, where you can make a real difference." Emily remained silent for a moment, clearly overwhelmed by the offer. Finally, she spoke. "I appreciate your offer, Michael, but I need time to think about it. All of this is a lot to process." Michael nodded, understanding. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But there's something else you should know." Emily looked at him expectantly. "I plan to reveal my identity to all employees during the anniversary celebration," Michael explained. "I want to be transparent about what I've seen and the changes I plan to make. Can I count on your discretion until then?" Emily nodded slowly. "Yes, you can count on me. But Michael, whatever you decide to do, remember that there are real people whose lives will be affected. They're not just pieces on a corporate chessboard." Emily's words resonated deeply with Michael. "I know," he said softly, "and I promise I'll keep that in mind in every decision I make." They stood up from the bench, the night already advanced around them. Before parting, Michael looked at Emily one more time. "Thank you, Emily, for your honesty, your compassion, and for reminding me why I started all this in the first place." Emily offered him a small smile. "Good night, Michael. See you at the anniversary." As he watched her walk away, Michael realized that this conversation had been a turning point, not just for his company, but for him personally. He had rediscovered his purpose and, In Emily, he had found someone who inspired him to be better. The following days were a whirlwind of activity for Michael. Between planning changes in the company and preparing for the big reveal, he barely had time to breathe. However, he couldn't stop thinking about Emily and the conversation they had had. The day of the anniversary arrived faster than he had expected. The pizzeria was festively decorated, and all employees were present, expectant for the speech of the special guest they had been promised. Michael, dressed in an elegant but unpretentious suit, waited nervously backstage. He knew that what he was about to do would change everything. As he prepared to go out, he saw Emily among the crowd. She offered him an encouraging smile, and somehow that gave him the strength he needed. Taking a deep breath, Michael stepped out into the main area of the pizzeria. A surprised silence fell over the crowd as they recognized him. Oscar, in particular, looked as if he had seen a ghost. "Good afternoon, everyone," Michael began, his voice firm but kind. "For those who don't recognize me, I'm Michael Carter, the founder of this company, and I have a story to tell you." What followed was a speech that no one in that room would ever forget. Michael shared his experience of the past few weeks, sparing no details about what he had seen and learned. He spoke of the discrimination and corruption he had witnessed, but also of the acts of kindness and compassion that had moved him. "I've seen the best and worst of our company," he said, his gaze sweeping the room, "and I've realized that we've strayed from the values that founded us. But today, here and now, that's going to change." He announced a series of immediate measures: Oscar's dismissal, a complete review of company policies, and a new training program focused on inclusion and respect. "And to lead these changes," he continued, "I need someone who embodies the values we want to promote. Someone who has demonstrated compassion, integrity, and courage in day-to-day operations." Everyone's eyes followed Michael's gaze until they rested on Emily, who seemed as surprised as the rest. "Emily," said Michael, extending his hand towards her, "would you do me the honor of accepting the position of Director of Culture and Values for our company?" A murmur of surprise ran through the room. Emily, with tears in her eyes, slowly walked towards Michael. "Yes," she said, her voice full of emotion. "I accept." As the room erupted in applause, Michael and Emily looked at each other, aware that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, not only for the company, but for themselves. What neither of them knew at that moment was that this decision would trigger a series of events that would not only transform the company, but would also lead them down a personal path that neither had anticipated. The journey ahead was full of challenges, revelations, and perhaps something deeper and more personal than they had ever imagined. The weeks following Michael's announcement were a whirlwind of changes and challenges. The news of his undercover experiment and the drastic changes in the company spread quickly, generating a mix of reactions among employees, customers, and the media. Emily, in her new role as Director of Culture and Values, found herself navigating uncharted waters. She went from being a simple waitress to having an office in the corporate building, working side by side with Michael to implement the new policies. "How's the new training program going?" Michael asked one afternoon as they reviewed reports in his office. Emily sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's a challenge. Some employees are enthusiastic about the changes, but others, well, let's say the resistance is strong, especially among those who were close to Oscar." Michael nodded, understanding. It was to be expected. Change is never easy, especially when it challenges ingrained beliefs. "I know," said Emily, determination shining in her eyes. "But every time I feel discouraged, I remember why we're doing this. For people like my father, who have been discriminated against all their lives, for customers who deserve to be treated with respect regardless of their appearance, for employees who want to work in a fair and welcoming environment." Michael looked at her with admiration. In the past few weeks, he had seen Emily grow and adapt to her new role with a grace and strength that constantly impressed him. "You're amazing, did you know that?" he said, without thinking. Emily blushed slightly, but maintained her professional composure. "I'm just doing my job, Michael." There was a moment of silence between them, charged with a tension that both had been trying to ignore. Since the day of the announcement, their relationship had evolved. They were no longer just boss and employee, not even just friends. There was something more, a connection that went beyond the professional, but that neither dared to name. The moment was interrupted by the sound of the phone. It was David, Michael's assistant. "Sir, you have an urgent call from the legal department," David reported. "It's about Oscar's lawsuit." Michael frowned. "Thank you, David. I'll take it in a moment." When he hung up, Emily looked at him worriedly. "Is Oscar suing us?" Michael nodded, massaging his temples. "He's alleging wrongful dismissal and defamation. It was to be expected, but still." "We'll overcome this," Emily said firmly, placing a hand on Michael's. "We have the truth on our side." The contact, though brief, sent an electric current through both of them. They looked at each other for a moment before Emily withdrew her hand, aware of how inappropriate it might seem. I should go," she said, gathering her things. "I have a meeting with the Human Resources team in 10 minutes. Michael nodded, trying to ignore the feeling of loss as Emily walked away. "Of course. I'll see you tomorrow at the directors' meeting." When Emily left, Michael stood staring at the door, lost in his thoughts. He knew that what he was feeling for Emily went beyond professional admiration. But he was also aware of how complicated it would be to start a relationship with her, given their position in the company. Meanwhile, Emily walked towards her next meeting, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She was proud of the work they were doing, excited about the positive changes she saw in the company. But she was also confused by the feelings she was developing towards Michael. What neither of them knew was that the challenges they faced in the company would soon pale in comparison to the personal obstacles they would have to overcome. The path towards transforming the company and their own lives was just beginning, and the most difficult tests were yet to come. That night, as Michael drove back home, he received a call that would change the course of events. It was Richard Foster, his old friend and business partner. "Michael, we have a problem," Richard said, his voice laden with concern. "I've heard rumors that some investors are nervous about the changes you're making. They're considering withdrawing their support." The news hit Michael like a bucket of cold water. He knew his actions would have consequences, but he didn't expect such a quick and drastic reaction. "Thanks for letting me know, Richard," he said, trying to maintain his calm. "What else do you know?" "Not much more. But I suggest you prepare a contingency plan. If the investors pull out, you could face serious financial problems." After hanging up, Michael sat in his car, parked in front of his house, lost in thought. The changes he was implementing were necessary. He was sure of that, but at what cost? Was he willing to risk everything he had built? With a sigh, he took out his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Emily? I know it's late, but I need to talk to you." "Can we meet?" Emily's response was immediate. "Of course. Where shall we meet?" Half an hour later, Michael and Emily were sitting in a small 24-hour cafe, steaming cups of coffee in front of them. Michael told Emily about Richard's call and the possible consequences. "What are we going to do?" Emily asked, her face a mixture of concern and determination. Michael looked at her, surprised by the use of "we." It was a reminder that he was no longer alone in this. "I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me wants to move forward regardless of the consequences, but another part is afraid," Emily softly completed. Michael nodded, grateful for her understanding. "Exactly. I've worked all my life to build this company. The idea of losing everything..." Emily extended her hand across the table, taking Michael's. This time, neither of them pulled away. "Listen," she said, her voice full of conviction. "And what we're doing is right. We're changing lives, Michael. Not just for employees and customers, but for all the people who see themselves represented and respected in our actions. That's worth more than any investment." Michael felt something loosen in his chest. Emily's unwavering faith, her passion for what they were doing, was contagious. "You're right," he finally said. "We can't turn back now. We'll find a way to overcome this." They looked at each other for a long moment, their hands still intertwined on the table. The tension between them was palpable, charged with unspoken emotions and restrained desires. Finally, Michael broke the silence. "Emily, I..." But before he could continue, Emily's phone rang, breaking the moment. She looked at him apologetically before answering. "Dad, what's wrong?" Her face paled as she listened. "I'm on my way right now." She hung up and looked at Michael with concern. "My father, he's in the hospital. He had a relapse." Michael stood up immediately. "I'll drive you." The trip to the hospital was tense and silent. Michael could feel the anxiety emanating from Emily and wished he could do more to comfort her. When they arrived, he accompanied her to the emergency room. "Go," he said softly. "I'll be here if you need me." Emily gave him a grateful look before disappearing behind the hospital doors. The hours passed slowly. Michael stayed in the waiting room, ignoring the curious glances from nurses and other patients who recognized him. Finally, near dawn, Emily emerged, looking exhausted but relieved. "He's stable," she said, collapsing into the chair next to Michael. "But the doctors say he'll need more intensive treatment." "A treatment we can't afford." Michael didn't hesitate. "I'll take care of the expenses." Emily looked at him, surprised. "Michael, I can't accept that. It's too much. Please," he insisted, "let me do this for you, for your father." There was a moment of silence as Emily struggled internally. Finally, she nodded, tears of gratitude and relief welling up in her eyes. Without thinking, Michael pulled her close, hugging her tightly. Emily clung to him, letting the emotions of the past few hours wash over her. When they finally separated, their faces were inches apart. The atmosphere between them changed, charging with an electric tension. Slowly, almost as if drawn by an invisible force, their lips moved closer. But just before they met, Emily pulled back, the reality of their situation suddenly hitting her. "We can't," she whispered. "You're my boss. People will talk. It will put everything we've worked for at risk." Michael closed his eyes, fighting against the desire to ignore all the reasons why this was a bad idea. "You're right," he finally said. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." "No," Emily interrupted. "Don't apologize. I'm sorry too. It's just that—" "It's complicated," Michael completed. They looked at each other, a mixture of desire and resignation in their eyes. They knew that what they felt for each other was real. But they were also aware of the consequences it could have for the company and for the mission they so firmly believed in. "We should go," Emily finally said. "We have a company to run." Michael nodded, trying to regain his professional composure. "Of course, I'll take you home to rest. Take the day off. I'll handle everything at the office." As they left the hospital, they both knew that something fundamental had changed between them. They had crossed a line, and although they had stepped back before taking the final step, they could no longer deny the feelings that existed. The following days were an exercise in self-control for both of them. In the office, they maintained a facade of professionalism, but the underlying tension was evident to everyone around them. Meanwhile, the challenges in the company continued to pile up. Rumors about nervous investors had spread, and Michael found himself fighting on several fronts to keep his vision afloat. One afternoon, while reviewing the latest financial reports, Emily noticed something strange. "Michael," she said, frowning as she looked at her computer screen. "I think you should see this." He approached, leaning over her shoulder to look at the screen. The scent of her perfume momentarily distracted him before he focused on the numbers in front of him. "This can't be right," he murmured, his eyes scanning the figures. "It looks like someone has been manipulating the books." Emily nodded gravely. "And I think I know who. Look at these transactions. They all coincide with the dates when Oscar was doing the monthly reports." The realization hit them both. They weren't just facing resistance to change and possible loss of investors, but now they also had to deal with potential financial fraud. "This changes everything," said Michael, straightening up. "If we can prove that Oscar was manipulating the books, his lawsuit against us will fall apart. And more importantly, we could show the investors that the financial problems aren't a result of our changes, but of the corruption we're trying to eradicate." Emily looked at him, a spark of hope in her eyes. "Do you think we have enough evidence?" "I don't know," Michael admitted, "but we're going to find out. We need to review every transaction, every report from the last few years. It's going to be an enormous task." "Then we better get started," Emily said, determined. They looked at each other, aware that they were about to embark on a monumental task that could save or sink the company. But more than that, they both knew that working so closely, especially during long nights at the office, would test their resolve to keep their relationship strictly professional. What they didn't know was that this challenge would not only determine the future of the company, but would also lead them to confront their feelings in a way they could no longer ignore. The road ahead was full of obstacles, but also possibilities that neither of them dared to imagine yet. Days turned into weeks as Michael and Emily immersed themselves in the task of unraveling years of financial records. The office became their second home, with nights stretching into dawn and weekends dedicated to reviewing documents and tracking suspicious transactions. One particularly late night, while the rest of the building was silent, Michael looked up from his computer to find Emily asleep on a pile of papers. His heart clenched at the sight. She had been working tirelessly, balancing her new responsibilities with caring for her sick father. Gently, Michael placed his jacket over Emily's shoulders. The movement woke her, and she blinked, disoriented for a moment. "What time is it?" she asked, her voice hoarse from sleep. "Almost 3 in the morning," Michael replied, offering her a cup of freshly made coffee. "You should go home, Emily. You've been here since 6 yesterday morning." Emily shook her head, straightening up and gratefully accepting the coffee. "I can't. We're so close to finding the proof we need." "I can feel it." Michael looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Your dedication is incredible, but I'm worried you're pushing yourself too hard." Emily returned his gaze, a small smile on her lips. "Look who's talking. You haven't left this office in days." They shared a tired laugh, aware of how much they had both invested in this project. The silence that followed was charged with unspoken emotions, feelings that had been growing despite their best efforts to keep them at bay. It was Emily who finally broke the silence. "Michael, what are we doing?" He looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "This," she said, gesturing to encompass the office, the scattered papers, and the space between them. "We're risking everything for this company, our time, our health, our personal relationships." Michael felt his heart rate quicken. He knew exactly what Emily was referring to, but he had been avoiding facing that reality. "Emily, he began, but was interrupted by the sound of his phone. It was David, his assistant. "Sir, I'm sorry to bother you so late, but we have a situation. Oscar is here, in the lobby. He demands to speak with you. He says he has information that could sink the company." Michael cursed under his breath. "I'm on my way." "Don't let him leave." He hung up and looked at Emily, who had overheard the conversation. "We need to go downstairs. Oscar is here." Emily nodded, her face a mask of determination. "Let's go." When they reached the lobby, they found Oscar pacing nervously, flanked by 2 security guards. Upon seeing Michael and Emily, his face contorted into a sneer. "Well, well," he said, his voice laden with sarcasm. "The big boss and his protégé. How appropriate." Michael stepped forward, his voice cold and controlled. "What do you want, Oscar?" Oscar smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I want my job back, and compensation for the damage to my reputation. Or else..." "Or else what?" Emily challenged. Oscar looked at her with disdain. "Or else, I'll be forced to share certain information with the press. Information about how the great Michael Carter has been manipulating the company's finances to cover his new progressive policies." Michael felt the blood freeze in his veins. Oscar was trying to turn the situation around, accusing him of the same crimes he had committed. But before he could respond, Emily stepped forward. "It's funny you mention finances, Oscar, because we've spent the last few weeks reviewing every transaction, every report you've submitted in recent years." Oscar's smile faltered for a moment. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," Emily continued, her voice firm. "We've found discrepancies, Oscar, many discrepancies. Money disappearing, falsified reports, all with your signature." The color drained from Oscar's face. "You're lying. You have no proof." It was then that Michael intervened. "Actually, we do. And right now, they're being delivered to the proper authorities." Oscar looked around like a cornered animal. For a moment, it seemed he might try to flee, but the security guards moved closer, blocking his exit. "It's over, Oscar," Michael said. "The police are on their way." It's time for you to face the consequences of your actions." As Oscar was escorted out of the building, Michael turned to Emily. The adrenaline from the confrontation was still running through his veins, and before he could think twice, he pulled her close and kissed her. For a moment, the world stood still. All that existed was the two of them, their lips joined in a kiss that had been building for months. When they finally separated, they were both breathless. They looked at each other, a mixture of surprise and desire in their eyes. I'm sorry," Michael began. "I shouldn't have..." But Emily silenced him with another quick kiss. "Don't apologize. I wanted it too." They stood there in the middle of the lobby, aware that they had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. They knew they would face challenges, that there would be those who would question the ethics of their relationship given their position in the company. But at that moment, none of that mattered. "What do we do now?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. Michael took her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "Now, we face whatever comes, together." As they left the building toward the dawn of a new day, they both knew this was just the beginning. They had overcome a major obstacle, but the road ahead was full of challenges. However, for the first time in a long time, they felt prepared to face them. What they didn't know was that fate had more surprises in store for them, some that would test not only their newly formed relationship, but also their vision for the company and their own personal values. The journey they had begun together was far from over, and the most shocking revelations were yet to come. The weeks following Oscar's arrest were a whirlwind of activity. News of the financial fraud and the subsequent restructuring of the company spread quickly, generating a wave of reactions in the media and the industry. Michael and Emily found themselves navigating not only the business challenges, but also the complexities of their new relationship. They decided to be transparent with the employees and the board of directors about their situation, facing ethical concerns head-on. One morning, as they prepared for an important meeting with investors, Emily noticed that Michael seemed particularly tense. "Are you okay?" she asked, placing a hand on his arm. Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm worried, Emily. This meeting could determine the future of the company. If we can't convince the investors that our new policies are beneficial in the long term," Emily interrupted him with a soft kiss, "we'll succeed. We have the numbers on our side, and more importantly, we have the truth. We're doing the right thing, Michael." He smiled, grateful for her support. "You're right. Let's do this." The meeting was tense from the start. The investors, led by a man named Victor Rojas, made no effort to hide their skepticism about the changes implemented by Michael and Emily. "Mr. Carter," Rojas began, his voice laden with condescension, "we understand your enthusiasm for these new inclusion policies, but numbers don't lie. We've seen a drop in profit margins since you implemented these changes." Michael remained calm, though Emily could see the tension in his jaw. "Mr. Rojas, if you'll allow me to explain, the drop in margins is temporary. We're investing in training and improvements in working conditions. In the long term, this will result in greater productivity and employee loyalty. Not to mention," Emily interjected, "that we've seen a significant increase in customer satisfaction since we implemented these policies. Our surveys show a 30% increase in brand loyalty." Rojas looked at her with barely disguised disdain. "With all due respect, Miss Director Garcia," Michael corrected, his voice firm. Rojas paused, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "Director Garcia," he continued, the title sounding forced on his lips. "Satisfaction surveys don't pay the bills. Investors need to see tangible results." The tension in the room was palpable. Michael was about to respond when the door burst open. David, Michael's assistant, rushed in. "Excuse the interruption," he said, out of breath, "but you need to see this." David turned on the TV in the boardroom. On the screen, a reporter was standing in front of one of the pizzeria branches. In a surprising turn of events, former employees of the pizza chain have come forward with accusations of discrimination and workplace abuse. They claim that the recent inclusion policies are just a facade to cover up years of questionable practices. The silence in the room was deafening. Michael and Emily exchanged looks of shock and concern. Rojas was the first to break the silence. "Well, Mr. Carter, it seems you have more explaining to do." Michael stood up, his face a mask of determination. "Gentlemen, I assure you that these accusations are unfounded. We have worked tirelessly to create a fair and respectful work environment. We will thoroughly investigate these claims and—" "I think we've heard enough," Rojas interrupted. "Gentlemen, I propose we reconsider our investment in this company." As the investors began to murmur among themselves, Emily approached Michael. "What do we do now?" she whispered. Michael looked at her, his eyes full of determination. "We fight. This is not the end, Emily. It's just another obstacle we'll overcome together." They left the boardroom towards an uncertain future. The storm they had feared had finally arrived, and now they would have to navigate through it, trusting in their vision and the strength of their relationship. What they didn't know was that this crisis would not only test their leadership and commitment to their values, but would also reveal unexpected truths about the company's past and about themselves. The road ahead was full of challenges, but also opportunities to demonstrate the true strength of their vision and their love. The following days were a whirlwind of frantic activity. Michael and Emily worked tirelessly to counter the accusations and keep the company afloat. Nights grew long in the office, reviewing documents, preparing statements and defense strategies. One night, while reviewing old personnel files in search of any evidence that could support their case, Emily found something strange. "Michael," she called, her voice tense, "I think you should see this." He approached, leaning over her shoulder to look at the computer screen. It was an old email sent by Michael's father, the original founder of the company, years before Michael took control. The content of the email made Michael's heart stop for a moment. It was an explicit order to discriminate in hiring, favoring certain groups over others. "This can't be true," Michael murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "My father, he wouldn't do this." Emily took his hand, offering silent comfort as Michael processed the information. "Maybe there's an explanation," she suggested softly. But as they delved deeper into the files, they found more evidence of systematic discriminatory practices dating back to the early days of the company. It was as if everything Michael believed about his father's legacy was crumbling before his eyes. "All this time," Michael said, his voice breaking with emotion, "I've been fighting against a system that my own father instituted. How could I have been so blind?" Emily hugged him tightly. "You're not responsible for your father's actions, Michael. What matters is what you're doing now to change things." Michael pulled away gently, his eyes shining with new determination. "You're right. And now I know what we have to do." The next day, Michael called a press conference. With Emily by his side, he stood in front of a crowd of journalists and cameras. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice firm despite the emotional turmoil inside him. "I'm here today to address the recent accusations against our company, but more than that, I'm here to tell the whole truth." Taking a deep breath, Michael proceeded to reveal everything they had discovered, including the discriminatory practices instituted by his father. "I'm not here to excuse these actions or to deny our history," he continued. "I'm here to openly acknowledge it and to commit, before all of you, to do things differently from now on." He detailed the changes they had already implemented and plans for the future, including a compensation fund for employees who had been victims of discrimination in the past. "I know these revelations may shake the confidence many of you had in our company," he concluded, "but I ask you to judge us not by the mistakes of the past, but by our actions from now on. We are committed to being an example of inclusion and justice in the business world." When he finished, there was a moment of silence before the room erupted in questions. Michael and Emily answered them with honesty and transparency, not evading even the most difficult ones. That night, exhausted but relieved, Michael and Emily sat in the office, watching reactions to the press conference on the news. "Do you think it will work?" Emily asked, resting her head on Michael's shoulder. He hugged her, gently kissing her forehead. "I don't know, but whatever happens, at least we know we did the right thing." As they watched the news, a message appeared on Michael's phone screen. It was from Victor Rojas, the leader of the investors. "Impressive move, Carter. Maybe we underestimated you. Let's meet tomorrow. I think we have a lot to discuss." Michael showed the message to Emily, a small smile forming on his lips. "It seems we're not out of the game yet." Emily returned his smile. "I never doubted you." They kissed softly, aware that although they had overcome a great obstacle, the road ahead was still full of challenges. But now, more than ever, they were sure that together they could face anything the future held for them. What they didn't know was that fate had one last test prepared for them, one that would test not only their relationship and their vision for the company, but also their very understanding of what success and personal fulfillment meant. The following months were an emotional roller coaster for Michael and Emily. The public revelation of the company's history of discrimination had generated a media storm, but it had also opened the doors to an honest dialogue about inclusion in the business world. Surprisingly, Michael's transparency had had a positive effect on many customers and employees. People appreciated his honesty and commitment to change. Sales, which had initially fallen, began to slowly recover. One afternoon, as Michael and Emily were reviewing the latest financial reports, they received an unexpected visit. It was Richard Foster, Michael's old friend who had nearly discovered his identity months ago. "Michael, old friend," Richard greeted, entering the office. "I've been following your story in the news. I must say I'm impressed." Michael stood up to greet his friend. "Richard, what a surprise. Thanks for coming." Richard looked at Emily and smiled. "And you must be the famous Emily. I've heard a lot about you." Emily shook his hand, smiling. "All good, I hope." "Oh, more than good," Richard replied with a wink. "In fact, it's because of you and what you've achieved together that I'm here." Michael looked at his friend curiously. "What do you mean?" Richard took a seat, his expression turning serious. "I've been talking to some colleagues in the business sector. Your story, the way you've handled this crisis, has made a big impression. There's a group of investors interested in backing companies that demonstrate a true commitment to social responsibility and inclusion." Michael and Emily exchanged surprised looks. "Are you saying—" Emily began. Richard nodded. "I'm saying that if you're interested, we could be talking about a significant investment in your company, with the condition, of course, that you maintain your commitment to inclusion and social responsibility policies." The news left them speechless for a moment. It was more than they had dared to hope for. "Richard, this is incredible," Michael finally said. "But I need to know. Why? Why now?" Richard leaned forward, his expression serious. "Because what you're doing here is important, Michael. You're demonstrating that a company can be successful and socially responsible at the same time. And in today's world, that's something many of us believe is the future of business." Emily took Michael's hand, squeezing it gently. "What do you think?" she asked quietly. Michael looked at Emily, then at Richard, and finally around the office that had witnessed so many changes in recent months. "I think it's an incredible opportunity," he said finally, "but we need to discuss the details. We want to make sure our values and vision remain intact." Richard smiled. "Of course, I expected nothing less from you. How about we meet next week to discuss the terms?" They agreed on a date, and Richard said goodbye, leaving Michael and Emily alone to process the news. "I can't believe it," Emily said, shaking her head in amazement. "After everything we've been through." Michael pulled her close, hugging her tightly. "We did it, Emily. Together." They kissed softly. The kiss charged with all the emotions of the past few months. The fear, the struggle, the determination, and, finally, the hope. When they separated, Michael looked at Emily seriously. "You know, all of this has made me think about the future, about what really matters." "What do you mean?" Emily asked, intrigued by the tone of his voice. Michael took her hands in his. "I mean that life is too short to wait when you know what you want." "Emily Garcia, will you marry me?" Emily gasped, her eyes filling with tears. For a moment she was speechless, overwhelmed by emotion. "Michael," she finally managed to say, her voice barely a whisper, "are you sure? With everything that's happening?" He smiled, gently caressing her cheek. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. You've taught me what it really means to be strong, to be principled. You've been by my side in the hardest moments, and I can't imagine facing the future without you." Emily felt her heart overflow with love and happiness. "Yes," she said, her voice full of emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." They kissed again, this kiss charged with promises for the future. When they separated, they were both laughing and crying at the same time, overwhelmed by the joy of the moment. "Wait," Michael said suddenly. "Do I have something for you?" He rummaged in his jacket pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a simple but beautiful ring with a small diamond set in it. "It was my mother's," he explained as he slid it onto Emily's finger. "She always said she'd find someone special to give it to. I think she'd be happy it's you." Emily looked at the ring, then at Michael, her eyes bright with tears. "It's perfect," she whispered. The sound of applause surprised them. They turned to see David and several employees standing at the office door, smiling and cheering. News of their engagement spread quickly through the company, lifting everyone's spirits. In the weeks that followed, Michael and Emily immersed themselves in wedding preparations, balancing them with their responsibilities in the company. The investment proposed by Richard materialized, injecting new life into the company and allowing them to expand their inclusion and social responsibility programs. The wedding day arrived on a warm spring Saturday. It was a simple but emotional ceremony, held in the courtyard of the first pizzeria Michael had opened. Employees, friends, and family gathered to celebrate their union. During the vows, Michael looked at Emily with adoration. "Emily, when I met you, I was lost. I had forgotten why I started this business in the first place. You reminded me of what it means to have principles, to fight for what's right. You've made me not just a better businessman, but a better person. I promise that every day I will try to be the man you see in me." Emily, with tears in her eyes, responded, "Michael, you gave me the opportunity to grow, to be more than I thought possible. You taught me that true leadership is about lifting others up. I promise to always be by your side, challenging you when you need it, and supporting you always. Together, we'll build not just a company, but a legacy of love and justice." As they kissed, sealing their union, the guests erupted in applause and cheers. It was more than a wedding. It was the celebration of a new beginning, of a shared vision for a better future. At the reception, surrounded by friends and loved ones, Michael and Emily took a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought them here. "You know," Emily said, resting her head on Michael's shoulder as they danced, "when you started your undercover experiment, I never imagined we'd end up here." Michael laughed softly. "Me neither. But I'm grateful for every moment, even the difficult ones. They've brought us here." They looked around at the joyful crowd of guests. They saw employees from all levels of the company mingling and laughing together. They saw Richard chatting animatedly with Emily's father, whose health had improved significantly thanks to the treatment they could now afford. They saw David, now promoted to a management position, raising his glass in a silent toast to them. "We've created something beautiful here," Emily murmured. "We have," Michael nodded. "And this is just the beginning." As the party continued around them, Michael and Emily shared another kiss, sealing their commitment not just to each other, but to the vision they had created together. A vision of a company and a world where inclusion, respect, and love were the norm, not the exception. Months later, the couple found themselves in the office, reviewing the latest reports. The company had grown, expanding to new cities and countries, always maintaining its commitment to inclusion and social responsibility. "Look at this," Emily said, pointing to a graph. "Our employee and customer satisfaction rates are at an all-time high." Michael smiled, putting an arm around his wife's shoulders. "And the profits aren't bad either. It seems we were right after all. You can do good and be successful at the same time." At that moment, David entered the office, holding an envelope. "Excuse the interruption, but this just arrived. I think you'll want to see it." Michael opened the envelope and read the contents, his eyes widening in surprise. "We've been nominated for the National Corporate Responsibility Award," he announced, his voice filled with awe. Emily hugged him tightly, laughing with joy. "We did it, Michael. We really did it." As they celebrated this new victory, Michael couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them here. From an undercover experiment to a total transformation of the company and their own lives, they had faced prejudice, corruption, doubts, and fears, but had emerged stronger, more united, and more determined than ever. Looking at Emily, Michael knew he wouldn't change anything they had gone through. Every challenge, every obstacle had led them to this moment. And as they looked to the future, they knew that together they could face anything that came their way. "What are you thinking about?" Emily asked, noticing his thoughtful look. Michael smiled, gently kissing her forehead. "I'm thinking about how fortunate I am and how exciting our next chapter will be." Emily put a hand on her belly, a secret smile on her lips. Speaking of next chapters, Michael's eyes widened, understanding the meaning of her gesture. "Are you?" Emily nodded, her eyes shining with happiness. "Time are going to be parents." As Michael wrapped her in an excited embrace, they both knew that this was just the latest of many blessings their journey had brought them. And although the future would always be uncertain, they were sure of one thing. Together, they could overcome any challenge and create a legacy of love, inclusion, and justice that would last far beyond their own lives. Thus, in the office where it all began, Michael and Emily prepared for their next great adventure, secure in the knowledge that their love, their shared vision, and their determination would guide them through any obstacle they might face.